that you would like to share with the room, share with the panel, contribute, and hear other people's points of views. And indeed, that's very much where I would like to start, because I'd like to ask each of our panelists, in order for this particular one, what you see as the big challenges that are posed by technological change going forward in the coming decade and perhaps beyond. Erich, let's start with you with the IBM perspective on
All right. So first, let me start by saying I noticed a lot of the words are challenges. I would like to see that as opportunities. I will make the case that there is more opportunity than challenge here when we look at it in the right way. If you ask me the two most important things, there is one challenge which is of all of us, but mostly on the enterprises, and that's a challenge of trust. We will need to win the trust in these new services, in these digitized values that population, ecosystem, businesses can trust on how we deal with data. If we believe that data is the new fuel or the new raw material, then it is clear that we need to understand two things. First, and here I talk about opportunity, you would be surprised, only 20% of the data today is searchable. 80% is behind the enterprise's firewalls. So if anybody is concerned about somebody coming from the internet and stealing your data, it is up to you, okay? You sit on a treasure trove of data. But to be able to use them, we are going to have standards of responsibility around data. What do I mean? We have issued a manifesto, data responsibility at IBM, just to address a couple of points. We need to know who owns the data. We are very clear from an enterprise point of view. We think our clients own the data, and they own the rights to the derivative models. That addresses those who are data stewards towards those who are data peddlers. So there are businesses on the internet that make use of data differently for their use and not for their clients' use. So we need to be very clear. There need to be standards on privacy and protection. GDPR is a good thing. GDPR is a good thing. We need also to be very clear, there is no unlawful access. Whoever has the jurisdiction, we cannot have that. Otherwise, people are not going to trust the services. The same way, we need to be very clear on the use of AI and on the participation for our population. We talk about values. If we enshrine those values, and that's why I'm saying it's a joint job we have, it's part on the enterprises, part it is on the regulatory framework. So that's the first, trust. The second is the regulatory environment in itself. So we think digital single market is a great thing. It's a great thing. It is not just important to give certainty to the enterprises for investment, but it is important to be competitive. The US today has a digital single market in which every little company has access to 300 million consumers on a whim. If we have a fragmented system, however the fragmentation is, it is not necessarily legal. It can be hidden, like data location requirements for spurious motives that drive cost, geo-blocking, other things that have been tackled with DSM. It is very important that we get this environment fixed quickly. As the biggest trading block in the world, data flow, so the ability for data to be available along a worldwide supply chain without hindrance is fundamental. It won't work without it. And to say in the digital single market, the Commission, the last Commission, has done a lot consulting with the ecosystem. And we are encouraged by what we see, but we need to stay vigilant. Because, for example, in the trade negotiations, we still do not have data addressed specifically. And so we can see that other trading blocks would show up and make data location requirements that then become a hindrance. I would say so trust and the right regulatory environment go a long way to turn challenges into opportunities.
Okay, thank you for that. From Accenture's point of view, you're obviously at the cutting edge of a lot of that technology. What are the challenges that you're coming up with? The opportunities, as Erich has called them, but what are the challenges that you see, and how do you feel about the data regulation that's coming along?
I think just to re-emphasize the basics, when we look at what's going on, and I can cite you all the buzzwords, the nanotech, the quantum computing, the analytics, the blockchain, and so on and so forth, and last but not least, AI, which is probably the more pervasive what is going on right now. This is not an evolution, this is a revolution. And it's in that context that we need to look at the challenges. The challenges are not what I would say technical barriers. The challenges are really, you know, sort of do or die type things that we need to get right. And if you look at what we could expect from this evolution, that's why it's so important to talk about it, is take the AI, moving, as we speak, from piloting to mainstream. It's sort of in that pivot point in many industries. You let that run for another 15, 17 years. For those that invest all in, we predict this could mean a 40% like-for-like productivity increase, or zero. And like-for-like, since this is a game where early movers will really take a lot of advantage, we're talking about, for those, taking probably 30 to 40% more revenue and or profit. So this is the kind of order of magnitude we're talking about. The other data point that I need to give you to frame the challenge is, if you look at private investment in artificial intelligence only, just focusing just on that, 66% of that was done in the US, 17 of that was done in China. So you can calculate yourself what is remaining for the rest of the world. There's some good news, and we praise ourselves in Europe that our startups in 2017, just probably slightly over half of the startups were in and around AI. But, you know, it's all how you want to describe the glass being half full of half empty, right? And so in that context, so that's the first challenge, so the investment magnitude, so everybody understands the challenge. Then let's now go to the real challenge. 3. Number 1, our companies, our businesses struggle with how to deploy the technology. Not so much piecemeal and in its silos, but really how do you deploy this in a end-to-end way, such that not only it's about productivity improvement or efficiency gains, but it's also about having a different human-machine interface, if I can call it that way, so how jobs are augmented by tech and not just replaced by tech. So that aspect, and also the aspect of how do you innovate, how do you change entire supply chains, entire customer relationships, products, services, and the likes. And so this sort of all-in thing is, if you survey the CEOs of big companies, 80% of them tell you, oh, I want to have cost efficiency, I want to have the innovation, I want to have the augmentation of the jobs, etc. But only 13%, 10, it actually invests in that veneer and starts to get the benefit. That's challenge number 1. Challenge number 2 is the access to the skills. Now, we can probably spend the full day on that. But just again, not only looking at the traditional discussion about, oh, the government needs to change the education system, it's about skills, not the jobs. And I mean, you all had similar discussions in similar events as this one today. The reality is also in the business. Investment in AI in 2017 went up by 60%. So you could say, good news. How much was the increase in skill investment in that same year? only 3% of companies increase their investment. So that's not even 3% increase. Only 3% of companies increase their investment in skilling and reskilling. So this equation cannot hold. And it's not just, and it's again in the same veneer, it's not about too much thinking about we will save and we will become more efficient, so we need less people. No, we're going to do different things and we're going to do things differently, which requires different skills. We now, when you read some of the publications on jobs, we're talking about jobs about training machines to do what they could do better. We talk about explaining jobs, where you have AI or machine learning spit out results, and then you need to go and explain to people why they didn't get their mortgage, or why the cancer treatment didn't work, and try to explain what the AI actually helped us figure out in a way people feel we're transparent about it, people feel like, to your point, Erich, they can trust what we say, what the data say, etc. And then third but not least is the access to data. And we're in Europe, and I'm probably one of the big propagators of a responsible use of data, protecting the individuals and all of that. But we need to do that in a very smart way, because we all know that advance today in technology is actually built through the data and the availability of data to train and deploy your systems and improve the accuracy of your results. And if that is restrained, it means that in China and in the US, it's going to go faster, and their algorithms, their systems, their proposals are going to be more accurate, more to the point, more useful than the ones that we're creating in Europe. And that can never be the purpose. So in those contexts, we cannot only think about how do we protect the individual, and then in a separate silo, think about we need to do more in technology, why is it that we're behind? No, we need to do that in a holistic way and do smart measures that continue to also allow the business to fuel their trajectories of moving, what I would call moving to the new, rotating to the new. So it's sort of an and story we need to get to grips with in Europe, which is, I believe, the real third challenge that we're facing in our part of the world.
Yeah, and this is one that regulation could get wrong.
Exactly.
Overprotective on segmentation and on use of analytics. I mean, right now, just to say it, use of analytics is restricted in many cases to only to scientific use. That will not work for businesses. So,
and looking at it more from, I suppose, the Commission or your Commission's think tank point of view, how does that, what you've heard, chime with some of the challenges that you, I mean, this must be a huge part of the work that your think tank and your work involves.
Yes, of course. So thank you for the opportunity. And contrary to the gentleman who spoke ahead of me about the challenges, I just want to say that one of the key themes in Davos this year was actually Europe is back. And of course, there's always more to do, but the fact is Europe has grown faster than the United States in the last 2 years. Employment rates are at the highest ever, and investment has also picked up and is now at pre-crisis levels. So that being said, of course, it's not a time for complacency. I agree that technology adoption and diffusion needs to be a key priority. And I say that also speaking here at a conference of businesses. I think that in the first wave of digital technologies, European companies have frankly been a little bit too slow to understand how transformative this was going to be, and have really failed to take full advantage of digital technology. So if you look at the figures, only about 1.7% of European companies make full use of advanced digital technologies. Only about 10% of SMEs work with data analytics. So this is data, huh? I mean, how are you going to do really well on AI if you don't work with data? I mean, so the point is that it has sort of a cascading effect. If you don't get it in the first wave, you're probably not going to do terribly well in the second wave of AI, et cetera. So for me, I would really prioritize technology adoption and diffusion. The second point, I want to pick up on what Jo said about the digital startups. So it's true that Europe has really done a lot to help the startup ecosystem. I think it is now competitive. You can more easily start a company in Europe. You can raise your first 5 to 10 million without too many problems. But where we really need to do something is on growth and venture finance, where Europe essentially makes it impossible to scale up in the way that companies can do in the United States and in China. So here I think we really need to look at what we can do to put the kind of financing facilities on the table that not only enable startups but really scale-ups, because here Europe does have an issue and I think it's widely recognized. The third issue I want to put on the table that I think is very important going forward is essentially to rethink infrastructure a little bit. We always think roads and bridges, and that's very important. But I am convinced that digital infrastructure, in particular 5G, is going to be very critical going forward. And here I am very concerned that we are behind and that the investments that are needed are not coming forward. And I say that 5G is not just about a better surfing experience or a little bit quicker in the internet. I am convinced that future business models will essentially be built on 5G, so on autonomous driving, precision farming, personalized healthcare. That's not going to be possible to do without 5G. So I think we need to really, really zero in on this issue and tackle it. And then Europe has everything going for it if we do that.
Dieter, I'm wondering if what you've heard chimes with you. You come from Germany, from the Federation of German Industries. It's an economy that's built very largely on SMEs and other similar sort of size enterprises. Does a lot of what you've been hearing chime with the experience in Germany of the issue of access to investment, the issue of handling data, access to data, and so on? Do you see those as the challenges, or maybe you want to add some more to that list?
Let me first go one or two steps back and try an analogy. If digitization is to be compared with a strong upcoming wind, the first thing we have to do is to decide whether we want to shelter or whether we want to build windmills. And I think if I look at Germany, if I look at the SMEs, which you pointed out, that's the first question we have to discuss and we have to encourage, and that is something what I like in the first answer Erich gave. Let's not talk about challenges, let's talk about opportunities. We have to convince them that there are quite a lot of opportunities in taking the chance of a digitization. And secondly, we have to think about what are the elements of digitization. Is it just a buzzword, or does it contain elements which we have to care of as leaders, as management of an enterprise? And according to my opinion, it contains about 4 elements. One is digitize your own organization, how you act within your organization. Second, digitize your product. Third, digitize your process, because in much more cases, digitization is a question of processes rather than of products. And fourth, and that's coming to data, use digital data platforms. And you especially addressed Germany. In Germany, we spend quite a lot of time, quite a lot of money, and quite a lot of brain to keep extremely high level of data privacy. By doing that, we forgot a bit about data security and data safety, about protecting the data, protecting the transmission of data or the usage of data, the technical use of data. And my theory is we should change that a little bit, not just in Germany, also in Europe, maybe all around the world. And we should give these 3 pillars the same level. Data security is at least as important as data safety and as data privacy. And coming to the last point, data privacy, we still build data privacy laws and regulations on a basic principle which is called data poverty, which was founded somewhere in the late 60s in Germany because of a court decision in Germany. But data poverty is by no means the correct building principle for a data privacy issue in the 21st century, where we all want to use data. So what we have to do in that coherence is we have to replace the basic principle of data poverty by a principle of data sovereignty. And that addresses a totally different issue. It's not just a legal aspect, it's much more a technical aspect. We do have the techniques all over the world in different research institutes. We do not have off-the-shelf products we can buy. And I think these are the directions which we have not to walk, we have to run to be at the end the winners in a new digitized world.
So I'd like to open it up to the floor a bit, actually. I'm sure you've heard some points there that chime with some of the ways in which you operate. Maybe you are part of some of that issue. Maybe you are tackling some of that issue. Maybe you see it as an opportunity. But we've looked there at trust and skills and access to investment, access to data. I can see a couple of hands going up already. There's one there at the back. Any thoughts on what you've heard so far? Could you introduce yourself with your name and your affiliation, if you would?
I'm Gerhard Huemer from EURAP, the European SME Association. I would like to ask a question to Ms. Mettler. I fully agree when you say that there is a problem in financing scale-up in Europe. But when we speak with our startup companies, we hear even more often that the scale-up problem in Europe is a problem of higher costs than in US and in Asia and more time-consuming due to imperfect internal markets. Different consumer laws, different insolvency laws, different tax laws, etc. And then the circle is closed, because if you need more time and more money to scale up in Europe, then the investors will do it somewhere else. Is the Commission working on this problem? Thank you.
Okay. And do you want to jump in? I mean, I know you're not here to speak directly for the Commission, but is that something that you wanted to comment on?
Of course. I mean, and I think you know well that we are working on it. And that's why the digital single market, you know, why we have launched all of this. Of course, we understand that the market continues to experience quite a bit of fragmentation, but that is not only the fault of the Commission. I mean, as you know, we can also look to the member states for some of that responsibility. However, that being said, I don't think you can just look at economies, you can look at societies. And what I hear from the people in the startup community is that Europe is actually becoming more and more attractive. We are seeing fewer and fewer digital entrepreneurs leave either for across the Atlantic or across the channel. And that's a huge opportunity for us that I hope that Europe will seize. So my point is that as the world seems to move into, I don't know, maybe more illiberalism, or that Europe, I believe, is actually very attractive for these groups of people that start these kind of companies. So the mood that I hear from the startup community is actually much better than it used to be. And if we can keep some of these guys that have the potential to build these kind of companies in Europe, that's a huge, huge boon for us.
So what's changing in Europe that's making those digital startups and so on want to stay, rather than...
Part of it is...
We've heard Angela Merkel sort of trying to encourage them to stay, but we need more than politicians saying it, I suppose.
Part of it is not just around regulation. That's what was my point. You don't just exist in an economy, you exist in a society. And there I have to say that what is happening across the Atlantic, as well as across the Channel, is just making these places less attractive than they used to be. So it may not be that Europe has exponentially become that much more attractive, but there are certain values. This is also a conference about values, about democracy, about freedom. And here, I have to say, for people who care about this, Europe would most certainly be an attractive location to do business and to start your company.
Do we have any other questions at the moment from
the reality is, of course, that, and some of that will play, but the reality is that the most important change is the availability of money, because even a few years ago, even at startup and finding angel investments or the first couple of loans was difficult, and most member states have now programs in place where you can get cheap loans, participation, that you're not back due. The venture capitalists have a lot more money, and since the low, I mean, it's one of the consequences of the low interest, because all sorts of people with money are just looking for different ways to invest the cash, and the startup scene is one thing. And there's also a cultural thing going on with our millennials. You know, starting your own company has grown in image. I mean, it's just the cool factor is much better than it used to be. So those two factors, and I have a few startups in my family, if I talk to the guys and what makes them start up, they don't have to go to the US. They still will go to the US to scale, but they won't leave Europe, which is a different thing. And they have the money. So.
Kind of leads me to what is my next question, which is this business of trying to redress the balance between Europe and the competition in the US and China and other parts of the world. How do you think Europe, particularly with regard to technological change, innovation, AI, and what we've been talking about, is going to be able to continue to fight that battle to redress the balance? We've already heard today that Europe on that front is lagging behind. What are your sectors able to bring that would redress that balance?
I have a view here that can spin off the tone that the discussion has taken. Here's my sense, living half in the US and half in Europe. The discussion here in the last years has been very much a catch-up discussion to say, how can we get our startups ready? How can we give them the same market size? How can we give them the same access to angel capital? How can we scale them? What are the barriers? And what needs to be put in place? That's for sure an important piece. The discussion has been obfuscated sometimes a little bit by fighting yesterday's battles. I don't think that there will be a startup that will make a better Facebook than Facebook or a better search than Google. That is a battle that, that is not playing to the strengths of Europe. We were so convinced about Europe's strength in high-quality manufacturing that the only division of IBM outside North America, we placed Internet of Things into Munich. A worldwide division into Munich, the largest investment we made outside of the US in the last years. Because I alluded to it before, 20% of the data are out free roaming, 80% are behind the enterprise's firewalls. So instead of being disrupted by somebody coming from the outside, it's the time for the existing companies to disrupt themselves and to modernize themselves. I think there's a huge chance for Europe in that. So play a game that you actually have a comparative advantage in and win that. There are a couple of elements here that I think are still missing compared, if you want a comparison to the US. There's a base infrastructure. Anne talked about the base infrastructure, which is most on the communication side. I would argue high-performance computing and artificial intelligence are kind of reciprocally intertwined. Unless you make, mostly also for the small companies, you make available high-performance computing utilities that are really competitive. And we are talking pre-exascale, we are talking exascale. That is, if you want, where there is a significant amount of competition right now between the systems, if you want, the US, Europe, and in China. That's something we need to do. And the third one, and we already talked about it, is skills. Skills. This is a different game. It doesn't require university degrees for everybody. It doesn't. Dual systems, training systems. I mean, we launched PTech, an initiative where IBMers go and coach schools. We agree on curricula. We give them privileged access. I mean, there's a lot we can do together, but playing to win means playing to one's strength instead of fighting yesterday's battles. That's.
Let me support a bit what Erich says. I think as soon as it gets to enterprises, as soon as it gets to industrial data, to industrial digitization, we are much better off than the US. What we cannot compete with is the whole business-to-consumer business. That's no chance at all. We do not have the market size. So forget about doing a better, you mentioned Facebook or Google. That will not happen. But if you look at industrialized platforms, the data platform in industry, they are owned much more by European manufacturers. Of course, in quite a big portion, they are hidden between the company's walls. All the interfaces are standardized interfaces by industry standards, much more developed in Europe than in the rest of the world. So I think if we take the first word serious, let's look at it. It's something which is a challenge, but it will help us to compete in future. We have an excellent starting point. Where I'm a bit skeptic is the subject artificial intelligence. That's the reason why I didn't want to put it in the same basket. 20 years ago, AI, it had a different name, but AI research and development started in Germany. And most of our universities have given up on that because we didn't have the computing power, we didn't have the money to support it, and all of that stuff. We didn't have the data. And right now, we
Remind us what it was called then. What was the term that was used? You said it had a different name.
Künstliche Intelligenz.
Okay, well.
Just translate it.
It's the same, but in German.
So right now, we are in big danger that we lose that because, as Joe said, the majority of the investments in AI is not done in Europe right now. It's done in China. It's done in the States. So that's a difficult issue, and we have to keep that up. And let me underline a sentence Erich also said. We have to start to rethink our educational process. In quite a lot of European countries, and Germany is, sorry to say that, one of the bad examples, we do not have, let's say, IT or digital-oriented lessons in our basic school education. And I'm not voting to get 8-year-old software engineers or 8-year-old programmers. That's not my aim. But I'm deeply convinced that a basic digital knowledge is the best precondition for digital sovereignty in the future. So it's a kind of a basic competence for the future. And we have to really fast rethink our educational schemes in Europe, especially in Germany. We are, I think, far behind compared to the Nordic countries within the EU.
Can I ask if anybody in the audience has experience of this, particularly with regard to the competition from China and from the US in terms of working with new advancing technologies? Is that something that chimes with anybody in the audience? Not particularly. Okay, well, we'll keep going on that one. Yes, Yo.
I think one of the things we should consider is if you look at well, we know the US gets all the money, and the money flows almost automatically to the Silicon Valley, but also other poles of innovation in the rest of the US. So it's not just Silicon Valley. What China does, and frankly also Japan did this to some extent, is to have a sort of a comprehensive strategy. They have a country strategy. Now you can say it's a totalitarian state or sort of, but they have a comprehensive strategy. They even have a target. AI-based businesses, 150 billion by 2030 or 35. I forgot the exact year, but they have a precise target and a precise year. And then they will fuel the investment, I'm sure, through gazillion different initiatives that contribute to that theme. And I think there is a strength in there if governments would have the courage, and they did so in the past with some things I'm going to illustrate it with in a few seconds. If we could do a more comprehensive, and the EU could help coordinate that is not just one or two countries, but it's more pervasive. But look at what Germany did with X.0. X.0, your organization did a lot of work mobilizing the members, but also the Merkel administration was behind you and very voicey about what they would do, what they thought was important. So there's sort of a good osmosis and almost a central plan, if you will. We want to be big in this. It's our industrial base. We're going to rotate it to the new. We're going to invest R&D, et cetera, et cetera. So it can be done. And so Macron is working on something similar for AI. He's going to come out with that in 1 or 2 weeks. So if we do a more comprehensive view on how our strategy should look like country by country, but also EU-wide, and be more articulate, and even fora like this where some policy makers, business folks kind of align on sort of the grand scheme of things, I think it's not neat around the corners, but it's the right thing to do. If we then make sure there is enough money going in R&D, because R&D used to be this idea about you do R&D and then 10, 12 years later something comes out of it. Even fundamental R&D today could spring into something really great 2 to 5 years max. So the R&D investment is a sure bet, and we have very strong circles of institutes in Europe that we could leverage. I mean, Germany, what you do with DFKE, for instance, the Turing Institute in the UK. So there are the instances we can leverage. We should do it, but in a more accelerated way. And then we talked about the skill thing. And again, there, we have a sort of frozen middle, right? We have the top of governments, when you speak to them privately, they're all convinced we need to go much faster, and it's really a priority to shift gears. Also in the labor market, you know, in sync with this new educational paradigm. You talk to the people themselves. We even have surveys within bigger enterprises. Are people ready and willing, in different shapes and formats, to move along and rotate themselves to all these new skills? 60, 70% says absolutely. Yeah. We're willing to do the investment ourselves. We're willing to study, to learn, even in our free time. And then in between, we get somehow stuck with the structures, the change, the difficulties, the raiders in the machine that are having a tough time translating what the people know and what we and the top of the politicians know to something that really starts working, you know, in reality.
I just wanted in this context perhaps to mention that the Commission will come forward with a communication on AI, because of course it's important that these initiatives not only take place at member state level, but also at a European level. So I think that that is definitely recognized. Let me say that, I mean, of course there is a formidable challenge coming from China and the US, but if you look at the top research institutes, the top 100 research institutes on AI, 33 of them are in Europe. I agree. Europe has more programmers and engineers than the United States. We also know it's about machines. And I mean, who's better at machines than the Europeans? I mean, if you look at, we always speak about IoT, and of course, we're not so good maybe on the I, but we're pretty good on the T. And so the point is, you know, that, and you mentioned, who was it who mentioned the industrial data, you know, that our incumbent businesses sit on piles and piles of data that, frankly, the Googles and the Facebooks cannot have, because it's not consumer data, this is industrial data. So if we get a strategy going around this, coupled with a high standard. I mean, I think that Europe always needs to think about also how do we differentiate ourselves, because frankly, we're probably not going to be playing in the same field as China in AI. I mean, we have completely different privacy standards. I mean, there is essentially no data privacy in China, so of course they can work with data in a completely different way than we can. But that doesn't mean we cannot play. Perhaps, and I think in Europe, for Europe in any case, the only way we will be able to compete is if we set the highest standard. And that is oftentimes difficult to do. But here, let me say, it's also a necessity, because on AI, everyone very bullish, and it's of course really important. But there's also a flip side that is very dangerous around AI. And there's also a need to look at, for instance, autonomous lethal weapons, around what is called real fake news. I mean, there is now, if you look at the next wave of fake news, AI-enabled fake news, and who's going to be regulating that? Who's going to be looking into the ethical standards for AI? Frankly, I can only see leadership coming in that area out of Europe, you know. So the point is, we need to think about what is our competitive advantage here, and how are we going to do things the European way, and then try to be globally competitive.
But then you would, everybody has to agree on what you just said, but speed is of the essence. There are technologies you can buy, but learning and skill takes time. You can, I mean, you can catch up, but you know, up to a point. So while we need to fix all these conditions, and I mean, we have been vocal on in AI, you need three things. First, we need to make clear to people that this is not about substituting the human, it's about augmenting, if we are realistic. Okay, in 60, 70, 80, 90 years, we might have singularity, but not in anybody's lifetime. Second, transparency. Joe mentioned it before. These algorithms are beautiful. They give you an outcome, but you might want to know what reasoning process or what training data went in to tell you that you have this kind of cancer or another kind of cancer, because it might be relevant. And the third thing, as we said, is skills. So we need to fix that, but we need to be fast.
Yeah, I mean, I hear you. By the way, I think the business community can help with that, because, you know, I mean, I would encourage you then to really raise the awareness among policymakers why this is so important.
We do.
You lead me on to my next point, which is whether perhaps from industry point of view, whether we have the right policies to promote technological change. Is that something that, is the framework there? Is it a help? Is it a hindrance, if I may be so bold? I wonder if that's obviously playing a little bit into some of the competition elements as well. How does it look from an industry point of view? Dieter, maybe from the German
I think if we're talking about technological frameworks, we should try to develop them by ourselves. The business community must be the driving force to do that. We shall not wait until the governments or the Commission builds us a legal framework. So we have to do the first step. Of course, that has to go in coherence with our ethical expectations. That's not just when we talk about digitization, especially when it goes to artificial intelligence, we are not just talking about a tech dimension. It has much more dimensions which also have to be discussed. And I fully agree to Anne. Who would be better off than the European culture to discuss that? It's not blaming the others. But I think we have a competitive advantage if tech dimension and what do you call it, non-tech dimension go together or have to go together. But I see the business in the lead to do the technical part. What we need is an investment-friendly framework from the politics, which goes into very, very detail. We were talking about artificial intelligence research and development, which we have to force. And of course, that has to be fast. No 5 year, 6 year, 7 year decision processes, how we change the content of software engineer education at our universities. That will not help. So what we need is a framework by the political agenda which tells us that's the direction we support you, not the direction we want you to go. That's the Chinese way. The Chinese way is the government tells you where you have to go. We need a kind of a more encouraging way, and then we need the investments, we need the legal framework, starting by taxes and everything else. And we also need, let me address that as well, a kind of a societal framework. Being an entrepreneur, being a freelancer, being someone who runs an enterprise is not as popular in Europe as it is in the States or in other parts of the world. Joe mentioned that it was getting better, and I fully agree to that. But it's still not on the level like in the US. So we have to do some promotional aspects, some promotional activities to tell society how helpful it is when we have entrepreneurs doing their business here.
Jo, from a sort of a global actor's point of view, working with lots of different regulatory systems, how does that help or hinder technological innovation in a business like yours?
Well, it clearly hinders. And, you know, for big corp, at least the more successful big corp, let's just say they are successful despite that, and because of their size, they can afford to invest a bit each time to see what they can do to adjust and adapt. For younger enterprises, especially in Europe, of course, it's not as easy because they need to hop from one country to the next and then relearn whatever they have already learned, because most of the time they need to change again the product, the service, because the regulation is different, the data protection is different, right? So you cannot hide it. It is a hinder. It's at the same time what it also does, because this is a global phenomenon, right? It's not just Europe, and a lot of companies, even if they're relatively small, one are actually global companies, is you're getting more and more a need of a sort of a framework that actually, and to your point, Dieter, businesses develop amongst themselves. And you see these initiatives spring up. Things around responsible AI. So what are we going to agree amongst ourselves that responsible AI looks like? And what are we going to do and what are we going to not do? And what are some of the principles we're going to stick to and hold each other more or less morally accountable for if we're all working in the same environment and supply chain? So those kinds of things I see evolve, quite frankly, quite quickly. You used to have that only in things like climate preservation, right? Like the UN Compact and those kinds of things. I see now similar initiatives where people agree how they're going to treat this whole thing about displacement of jobs, fast automation, the AI, the questions around the ethical thing around the AI, the transparency, the bias, all of these things. And we sort it out amongst ourselves and try to find allies. And even if we're competitors on those kinds of things, I can assure you, you find the colleagues having the same interest and really trying to work together. So what I probably said before, this goes beyond the philosophy or agreeing on something in general. This is really companies seriously working together to agree on protocols. And that's kind of their way of dealing with the lack of unity across the globe. It's sort of a meta regulation that is sort of self-imposed, that is organically, you know, taking shape as we speak.
So, Anne, how does Europe deal with that if regulation and policy is being thought of in those terms, and how can Europe ensure that it develops a framework that meets what industry needs, whilst also reflecting those special values that we've all been talking about in Europe? The fact that we do have very strong worker rights and concern for the environment, the circular economy, sustainability, which are perhaps lacking in other parts of the world.
I mean, what I honestly have to say is sometimes challenging from the public policy perspective is because on the one hand, we're expected to make sure nothing ever goes wrong in a very fast-paced environment where technological change takes place. So, because if anything does go wrong, we are blamed. on the other hand, we're supposed to build this super enabling framework where companies can thrive and do business and scale up. And that, I have to say, sort of having a front row seat to this now, I understand, is a formidable challenge. However, that being said, I think the absence, which is not regulating and not paying attention to what some of the dangers are, is also not an option. So I think on some of the issues that Europe does indeed see itself perhaps as playing a major role in regulating some of the digital economy, because it is different from sort of the analog economy, and you know, even though there are many companies coming and complaining about it, I can tell you just as many are coming and are pushing for it, and so you exist in this constant sort of environment where people try to stop you and push you, and so whatever you do, you never get it right, and this is sort of what I have learned after my 3 years. That being said, I do think we need a little bit more of a framework here, because digital, as I said, is different from analog, and we don't see a whole lot of leadership elsewhere in getting to grips with some of these issues. Because let me say, I mean, since this is about values, there is a profound feeling among sort of social dislocation among parts of our society. I mean, we sit here and we talk about the engineers and the programmers. I know that they don't have issues, but others do. So I mean, what we did at the European level, for instance, is we have the European Pillar of Social Rights, which was essentially a reaffirmation of social values on social protection. I think these kinds of things are very important because, especially in Europe, where we have a comprehensive welfare state, it is important to say, as we go forward, we will still try to take care of you, but we will do it in a different way. We will, you know, not try to prevent change, because frankly, we cannot do that, but we will try to accompany you during periods of change in your life. And here, I have to say that the companies often leave the really heavy lifting more to the policy types, because it's for us to tell people often that the new reality is that you will not have a job for life. You will have several jobs and possibly several careers, you know. You need to rethink the educational system. All of that is very complex. So, I mean, I am always listening with great interest to sort of all the complaints, but seeing it from where I sit now, I have to say it's a formidable challenge, and it's really difficult.
And you gave us the challenge before to do our part. I think actually I would like to pick up one of Joe's comments here. Companies that operate worldwide, like Joe's company or my company, we have a role to play, and we can play a role, even influencing on both sides of, let's say, of the Atlantic, that we get together on standards. We did so with first the Privacy Shield, and then GDPR, and all the things. We are actively working it on both sides of the regulation, and in many voids, we are trying to fill in. We're saying, hey, we believe these are the minimum ethical rules that we should give ourselves as a commitment, even in the absence of strict regulation, because it's still nascent, okay? But that dialogue, I would agree with you, that dialogue needs to be more intense, and we are going to have the dialogue, not just in the countries, but at country level, EU level, and frankly, our biggest trading partner is the US. Okay, so we have affinity in values, whatever short-term agita there might be on one or the other side. By the way, with the UK too. So.
I'm getting signs that I think Monsieur Barnier, yes, in fact, I can see Monsieur Barnier has just arrived. I don't need a sign. So I think we will wrap up the discussion there. Thank you very much indeed for your contributions. And if I could ask for an applause, that's great. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean.